In Erie, Pennsylvania, I was 19 years old and working part-time as a cashier at a Dollar Tree. The job wasn't the worst. Easy hours, minimum wage, and typically quiet at night. The evening work suited my schedule, because I was balancing community college classes during the day. Most evenings blended into one another. However, something began that fall that I will always remember. The store was situated next to an old pizza place and a laundromat on a dull section of West 12th Street. Only one flickering bulb was visible over our entryway, and there weren't many streetlights out front. On most evenings, I worked alone up front with just one manager, who was typically hidden away in the back office. I first saw her in the middle of October. On the walkway right past the glass doors, an elderly woman remained still. She didn't enter, didn't check her phone, and simply stood with her hands folded in front of her, which led me to believe that perhaps she was waiting for someone. I assumed she was either erratic or simply preoccupied. However, she returned the following evening. Same posture, same time, same place. She wore dark shoes, a black knit cap, and a long brown coat. She never entered, but the wavering light made her face look pale. I questioned my manager about her by the third night. Probably just one of the seniors from the shelter a few blocks down, he said, dismissing it. They occasionally stray. She didn't seem to be roaming, though, the way she stood. It was like waiting. She always arrived about 7:30 p.m., which is roughly half an hour after the evening rush. She stood silently as if she were observing through the glass, refusing to talk or look. I made one attempt at waving. She did not respond. I started to anticipate her at that point. I would look toward the front doors at 7:30 and see her standing there, as if she had never left the previous evening. I began to feel after work I was anxious as I walked to the bus. Even though the roadway in front of me was always deserted, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. After clocking out one evening, I made the decision to wait and see whether she moved. I pretended to arrange the candy racks while I stood at the register, but I was actually simply observing her. She had not moved at all after 20 minutes. I omitted the rear that night rather than the front. I arrived a little early for my next shift, which was on a Saturday. The sidewalks had been wet all day, were covered in puddles and leaves. When I looked at the door at 7:30, she was standing, hat drooping, and her coat was saturated, which surprised me because I half expected her to be absent in this weather. She didn't, yet there was something strange with the way she stared. She constantly had her head cocked slightly downward, as if she were staring at the door's base rather than the interior. She also didn't blink. I began to question whether she even saw me standing there. Jen, a co-worker, was asked if she had seen the woman outside each night. "What woman?" replied Jen, scowling. When I clarified, she gave me a strange look and claimed that nobody had been out there the previous evening when she had left. I didn't confront Jen about it. However, I snapped a picture from behind the counter the following evening. I waited for her to reappear before stealthily taking a photo. There was nothing on my phone when I looked down at it. The walkway was deserted, as if I had captured a picture of the air that profoundly affected me. I even did some cleaning the glass to ensure there was no reflection or smear. However, she remained in the same spot as before, like a statue, still as death when I looked back up. I had a dream about her that night. She was in the supermarket following her hand across the racks as she went down aisle 4. I was unable to move during the dream, so I merely watched her turn slowly in my direction. After stopping in front of the greeting cards, I began to excuse myself from work more frequently by claiming to have schoolwork to complete. However, when I did go, rain or shine, weekday or holiday, she would be there. My manager yelled, "Don't start getting weird," when I asked her again whether she knew anything. This store is a problem in and of itself. I so ceased inquiring, yet my thoughts persisted. I looked up local obituaries and missing folks on Google. An elderly woman was discovered outside a shop on West 12th years ago. According to one article, she appeared uncannily familiar in the low-quality black and white photograph. Same face, same coat. I told myself that it was merely my brain creating links where none existed, but I knew better in my heart. There was something about her appearance. The fact that she never acknowledged anything or moved. It was not human. Something seemed to be acting. I promised myself I would stop. The tension was not worth the part-time work, but I couldn't afford to give up the schedule and I needed the money. I continued to attend despite the fact that each night made the closer 7:30 drew, the more queasy I felt. Then one evening I was alone myself at closing since the manager had left early. She wasn't there, but I kept my eyes on the door. For the first time in weeks, she was nowhere to be seen at 7:30. I felt a strange sense of relief until I heard a movement on aisle 4. The shop was deserted. An hour ago, we had shut the doors. Perhaps someone had slipped in or lingered behind, so I shouted out. No response. I strolled leisurely along the forceful thumping in the aisle. I noticed a coat's edge vanishing around the corner at the end of the row. I took a step back. I didn't pay attention. I was unable to. I reached for the phone behind the desk and tried calling the manager, but it kept ringing without getting a response. I had dreamt it, I told myself. It's just nerves. Then behind me, I heard faint footfall on the tiles. There was nobody there when I turned. However, one of the birthday cards was open and resting in the center of the aisle. I grabbed it. The interior was vacant, just empty. I set it aside and picked up my bag. I had no intention of remaining any longer. Once more, I went out the back. She was standing in the alley by the dumpster when I turned around, almost at the bus stop. Her face was dimly illuminated by the flickering light above, but her coat, posture, expression, and sound were all the same. The rear entrance. I choose not to ride the bus. I continued to walk. I gripped the phone tightly. That night, I walked 2 miles home. I then gave my 2 weeks' notice and just worked early shifts. I never saw her again, and I never worked another night shift. However, the sensation persisted. I would swear I saw her coat disappear behind a car when I was strolling through a parking lot. I once discovered a blank card in my mailbox. Blank, no handwriting, no envelope. Even though I tossed it away, I occasionally still consider it. I left that job more than a year ago. However, I continue to stay away from that area of West 12th Street. I occasionally see my reflection when I pass a shop at night. And for a brief moment, I believe I see her standing outside the glass behind me. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe if you like this story. Or to like, share, and subscribe if you like this story. In Denton, Texas, I was 23 years old and working part-time at a Dollar Tree. The store was already crammed with inexpensive candy displays, plastic pumpkins, and fake cobwebs in October. It was a job that paid barely enough to keep me afloat, but I generally worked evening shifts after my morning classes. Since Halloween fell on a Tuesday that year, a busy weekend was anticipated. We received a shipment that was delivered late on Friday night, right before closure. It was strange. The driver had little information and we had no scheduled activities. The boxes had only a red holiday tag on them and were plain brown without any Dollar Tree branding. Joyce, my boss, reluctantly agreed to it, primarily to avoid having to reschedule and deal with corporate afterwards. She instructed me to unload everything in the rear room after muttering something about a misunderstanding. The boxes felt strange even if they weren't heavy. They smelled slightly of old fabric that had been kept in an attic for too long. I began slicing them open to take a look inside. We didn't sell anything in the first couple, but they were filled with Halloween costumes. Realistic masks, sewn cloaks, and historic styles that didn't fit our inventory made them appear far too ornate. One had a cracked smile, a porcelain white mask, and a full clown suit. I asked Joyce if she had ever seen these outfits before and brought one out to her. She shook her head, scowled, and flipped the mask over. She stated, "This isn't from corporate," putting it aside as if it chilled her. "Just put them in a box. We'll give you a call on Monday." I started to doubt everything because of the uneasiness in her voice. In any case, we put a few on the shelf to occupy the empty space in aisle 7. Those strange outfits wound up in my area because I was supposed to face the Halloween aisle before clocking out. They were noticeable. No price, no marking, and black tags. Even placing half of them there escaped my memory. We only opened 5 boxes, I was certain. It was abnormally quiet in the final 30 minutes before closing. Only 2 customers remained on the streets after customers had started to leave. One of them, a child, murmured something to his father while pointing to the outfits. With an uneasy expression, the man led him away without a word. Something about the child's expression stayed with me as I watched them go. One of the outfits was gone when I came back to the aisle a minute later. Not purchased, simply absent. I examined the floor, looked around, and even asked the other cashier whether anyone had taken it. Nobody had. Even the door chime went unheard. The costume simply disappeared. Joyce gave me a weary expression when I told her about the missing costume. As she counted the till, half distracted, she added, "Perhaps someone walked out with it." However, the cameras revealed nothing, and we both knew the door's sensors would have triggered. In the past 10 minutes, nobody has traversed that aisle. That night, I didn't sleep well. Even though my flat was silent, the thought of the costume going missing kept coming to mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the broken clown mask and how something like that could simply disappear. Even though I didn't bring anything tangible, it felt like I had invited something home. Saturday's shift got off to a sluggish start. The store was buzzing in the morning as usual. College students purchase inexpensive party supplies while parents gather decorations. Joyce requested that I get more of the costumes from the back room without labels. She said that they might as well be sold. People are paying attention to them. I didn't like it, but I also didn't dispute. One of the crates was open when I reached the back. But it's not as if we left it. It was ripped, that hurried tear that appears to have been clawed into it. The costumes were mixed up inside with some missing and others half hanging out. I made an approximate count. 3 had vanished. The rear exit was locked and alarming when I checked it. Remained unaffected. To make sure it wasn't a joke, I even took a look at the ceiling panels. No indication of a forced entry. I hastily packed up the remainder and left. My chest felt constricted for some reason while I was alone myself in that room. I handed Joyce the remaining costumes while she was back on the floor assisting a customer. "Hey," she murmured. "Have you noticed anyone returning here recently?" I gave a headshake. She appeared uncomfortable once more, but she didn't press. She returned to the register after leaving them on a cart. Derek, another coworker, and I closed that evening. He didn't talk much, but we got along well. He called me over as we were stacking shelves at about 9:15. "Did you put this here?" he said, gesturing to the door to the break room. One of the clown costumes was leaning against the wall. I looked at it for a long time. The mask was exactly the same as the one from the previous evening. The same tiny fissure under the eye. The neck is wrapped in the same stiff cloth. That costume hadn't been touched since the previous evening. Derek hadn't either. It was not supposed to be there. I locked the storage closet door after throwing it into a box and pushing it inside. From then on, we didn't communicate much. I believe he also sensed that the costume had moved by itself. For the remainder of the shift, I continued to look over my shoulder. Joyce called me when I got up on Sunday morning. She sounded frightened. Derek failed to appear. I said, she said. At about 2 in the morning, he left a voicemail. There's something about footfall in the store after it's closed. I was at a loss for words. He never seemed jittery to me. Kind. Perhaps out of remorse or a need to see it for myself, I arrived at the store early. The exterior appeared okay, but as soon as I entered, I sensed a problem. The air felt heavy and the lights were fainter than normal. When I greeted Joyce, she hardly spoke. I went to tidy the stockroom at around noon. I had left the clown outfit in the open storage cupboard. I am aware that I locked it. I recall the click. The package was gone. Not merely relocated, but completely gone. The entire back room was empty when I checked it. Joyce claimed not to have touched it. I inquired as to whether she had listened to Derek's voicemail once more. She gave a nod. I heard laughter, he said. As if uttering it out may call forth something, she whispered. Similar to a child or someone posing as one. We didn't speak. For the remainder of the shift. I stayed after closing that evening. I needed to know what was happening. I sat where I could view the majority of the store and set up a little stepladder by the manager's office. Nothing happened at first, only the occasional creak of settling shelves and the hum of the lights. Then at 1:30 a.m., I noticed activity close to aisle 6. At first, there was just a flicker like someone running over. I got up silently since I didn't want to warn people or things about it. I froze when I looked around the corner. The costume of the clown was standing straight. It didn't move in a human manner. Like the fabric itself had sprung to life, it twitched, stiff and unnatural. With my heart pounding, I ducked back and tried to figure it out. Once more, I peeked. There is nothing there. However, one of the costumes that was hanging close to the register was swaying softly, as though it had been touched by a passerby. I ran. I didn't clock off, failed to seize my jacket. I simply sprinted to my car, shut the doors, and continued driving until I reached my apartment. My last shift at Dollar Tree was that one. I never returned. I never even picked up my last check. Joyce texted me a few days later. The house is being cleaned. That the inventory was not in sync. Too many things are absent. She never responded when I questioned her about the costumes. I continue to wonder if she witnessed what I did or worse. Perhaps that's why she didn't say anything. I occasionally went by that store. It is still in use. Every Halloween I stay away from Denton's east side despite the new signage and different staff. I have no idea where the costumes originated, but I do know one thing. They weren't intended for one thing. They weren't intended for sale. I began working part-time at a Dollar Tree in Charleston, South Carolina when I was 26 years old. I needed a diversion more than a paycheck that summer because my dad had died. Most evenings were quiet in the store, especially after 7 p.m. when there was no more foot traffic. It was the sort of quiet that seemed to be pressing down from above. Terry, the night manager, was the only other person I typically worked with throughout my 5 to 10 o'clock shift. He spent most of his time in front, watching the small surveillance screens behind the counter. My work was easy. Before closing, sweep every aisle, straighten merchandise, and replenish shelves. However, there's something about aisle 4 that always makes me feel anxious. Whether I passed through it in the morning or close to closing made no difference. Something didn't feel right. Even after apparently being fixed by maintenance, the lights there continued to flicker a little. Despite the presence of our holiday department and decorations, customers seldom ever stayed there. There was nothing eerie about the traditional sense. That was not all there was to it. I had to rearrange a consignment of cheap costume props in aisle 4 one evening in October. I was attempting to insert foam axes next to inexpensive plastic masks while kneeling at the bottom shelf. At that moment, I detected a subtle scent of an old-fashioned powdered perfume that seemed appropriate for a grandma. I looked around since it was so out of place. Of course, nobody was there. Terry remained at the forefront, and if the doorbell had rung, I would have heard it. The perfume was real, though. It seemed to belong to the person standing directly beside me. I made an effort to ignore it, but I felt like I was being watched. Even after I walked to a new aisle, that feeling persisted. I convinced myself that it was simply my imagination, perhaps brought on by fatigue or grief. However, the perfume remained in the air when I went back to aisle 4 20 minutes later. Even worse was the fact that one of the Halloween masks was facing the shelf. I froze for a second as I stood there looking at it. Since I had left it, I had not touched that mask or that shelf. Except for that one turn, everything was in place. I made an unconscious adjustment, but the hairs on my neck continued to stand up. I received the impression that someone had been there the entire time I was away. I glimpsed something out of the corner of my eye as I was sweeping later that evening and went by aisle 4. Perhaps it was merely a change in shadow, or it was a delicate shape. Behind the end cap, the aisle was deserted when I turned to look, but the same scent wafted past me once more. I wasn't dreaming. I asked Terry if he had seen anything strange in aisle 4 for the first time. After glancing up from his computer, he fell silent for an extended period of time. He murmured, "People say that aisle gives them chills," at the end. Some refused to even walk through it. I didn't press and he didn't go into detail. I arrived a little early the following evening and made it a point to browse every aisle before work. The shelves in aisle 4 were uncluttered and silent, but the lighting continued to flicker unevenly. As I neared the end cap, I held my breath, hoping that something would move. However, it didn't. It didn't. I was still staring at it when I saw something else. The Halloween exhibit has lost one of the ornamental tombstones. I looked over the inventory list and the tags for security. Not a single one had been sold. Terry simply nodded as if it hadn't surprised him when I informed him. "Every October we typically lose 1 or 2, he remarked. "Eventually they appear." That was nonsensical. Things didn't simply vanish and then reappear in this type of business. Too much attention was paid to the inventory for that. I turned around and inspected the aisle 3 times. And the perfume hit me again, stronger this time, almost dizzying as I knelt down to peer under the lowest shelf. The aroma was tougher to ignore now, but I didn't bring it up again. It wasn't hanging around. It was pursuing me. I also began to notice it outside the store, particularly after dark. One evening as I was making my way home, I thought I noticed a figure standing at the end of the walkway just out of sight of the street lamp. They vanished as I blinked. I was immediately hit by the perfume. With my heart racing, I came to a halt and looked everywhere. The street was deserted. I wasn't easily frightened, but ever since that night in the aisle, I felt as though I was carrying something unseen with me. They show up eventually. I finally asked Terry what he meant by that. After hesitating, he leaned forward as if he didn't want the cameras to record. He said, "There's a story. It said that something in that aisle detects grief as if it can sense when you're in pain. I simply gazed at him. He went on to say that it doesn't follow everyone, only those with whom it connects. At first I dismissed it with a joke, but the pattern made it more difficult. A few days later, a middle-aged lone customer with a condolence card entered. As soon as she stepped into aisle 4, she spun around, seeming terrified and pale. She simply left the card behind and left the store. I tried not to worry about it, but as I was shutting up that same evening, I heard something, whispers. They were breathy and delicate, like someone trying to talk through a wall gap, and they came from aisle 4. I listened in silence until they ceased. Then the scent returned more strongly than before. I did not look down the aisle. Without completing my closing list, I simply turned off the lights and left. It was evident from something about that night. Whatever was inside wanted to stop being disregarded. And for some reason, it had begun to listen to me. I was already tense when I started my shift the following evening, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered. Caution tape had been used to block off aisle 4. Terry spoke to 2 EMTs while standing close by. He simply stated that a customer had collapsed when I questioned what had happened. No condition, no warning. He didn't explain why the store smelled like perfume for hours thereafter, or why the metal shelf had scratches on it. There were others who also noticed. A cashier who had been employed there claimed it wasn't the first time, which was longer than I was. In October always, she muttered. That aisle always. I had to walk home by myself once more that evening. The wind was rustling the dried leaves against the curb, and the walkway was silent. To escape the typical course, I chose an alternative route, but halfway through the scent caught up to me as if it were leading rather than following. I didn't look back. I double-checked all the windows and closed the door when I arrived home. I was standing in my kitchen attempting to persuade myself that it was simply stress or the reappearance of sadness. However, I heard it again as the hallway light flickered. It sounded like someone whispering just outside my bedroom door. That night I didn't get any sleep. With my pulse pounding with every creak, I remained on the couch with all the lights on. I must have fainted at some point because when I woke up, there was only the slightest hint of that perfume on my jacket and the morning was silent. Without thinking, I tossed it aside. That day I made the decision to resign. Terry showed no surprise when I told him. Without saying anything, he simply nodded and gave me my final check. He whispered that certain individuals simply should not approach that aisle, particularly those who have lately lost a loved one. Even though I've been gone for a few weeks, I still feel it. I feel like I'm always a step behind that weird awareness. Even though I have a new job and a new apartment, I occasionally smell that same perfume when I stroll down specific store aisles, and I am aware that I still own it. Anything found in aisle 4 leaves the store. It selects individuals. Grieving people are like a second skin, and it doesn't let go once it locates you, not even when you believe you've moved on from it. I've given up attempting to explain it to other people. Most people wouldn't accept it. However, I understand how I felt. I am also aware that I am neither the first nor the last. Therefore, if you're in grief, avoid going inside a Dollar Tree if the lights above aisle 4 flicker. I worked the late shift at a Dollar Tree in Chicago when I was 29 years old. The store was always silent at night, especially after the last client had departed and the hours were long. The sound of my shoes squeaking on the tile, the hum of the lights, and the silence had all become familiar to me. It was quiet. However, something felt different tonight. 3:45 a.m. was displayed on the wall clock. When the final client departed. I was the only person in the store. Amid the cheap plastic items, I was by myself in the aisles. I noticed it just as I was beginning to scrub the counter. On the counter was an old, crumpled receipt. I'd never seen a receipt that looked like this before. As if it had been left here for years, it was yellowed with age. I lifted it up and felt strangely cold. It was signed Robert Adams. The name felt oddly familiar, but I couldn't place it. The receipt was dated 5 years ago. Things began to feel off at that point. I was certain that I had never served anyone by that name in my time working here since the store started. The receipt showed 4 a.m., which is precisely the same time as right now. I put the receipt down and tried to ignore it. Most likely it was just an old error, something that was eventually forgotten. But the longer I looked at it, the more I thought it didn't belong there. The lights above me flickered, and the store was quiet. Half expecting to see someone, I looked around, but the store was empty. I had the impression that I was being observed. As I looked at the receipt and tried to find out what was so wrong with it, the minutes passed slowly. My skin started to itch. I tried to keep myself occupied by grabbing the broom. The more time I spent at the shop, the more I started to feel uneasy. The aisles were long, and the shadows appeared to be moving due to the flickering lights. I didn't see anything when I looked along the aisles. I had a nagging suspicion that something was wrong. The air felt colder and my footsteps echoed louder than usual. I took another look at the clock. 3:55 a.m. I felt concerned since time was going more slowly, though the hush was oppressive. I began cleaning the shelves, but I couldn't get the receipt out of my head. It was precisely 4 a.m. now. At the same moment that the receipt appeared, I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I could feel my heart pounding. Robert Adams was who? After all these years, why was his receipt here? I looked around, but it seemed like the store was deserted. I made an effort to ignore the feeling of being watched, even though I knew I wasn't alone. I looked at the time once more and it was 4 a.m. It was the same, but I was unable to explain it. There was more to it than a coincidence. The hush was deeper and the air felt colder. I tightened my jacket, but it made no difference. It was suddenly too quiet in the store. The shadows seemed to extend unnaturally and I was unable to concentrate. I strolled, my footsteps echoed through the aisles, but the uneasiness persisted. There was a problem. It felt wrong in the store. I tried to get rid of the sensation that someone was observing me as I moved through the aisles. Now it seemed even quieter in the store, the sort of silence that was oppressive, half expecting to find someone standing there. I couldn't resist taking a quick look over my shoulder. However, the aisles were just as deserted as they had been during the night, though the receipt continued to taunt me from its place on the counter. I couldn't get it off my mind. Though I couldn't recall ever meeting him, the name Robert Adams kept repeating in my head. In an attempt to divert my attention, I chose to look around the back office. The papers might help me think more clearly. I saw something odd as I passed the aisles. This time the lights flickered for a longer period of time. The air felt cooler. I warmed myself by rubbing my arms, but the cold persisted. I had the impression that the store was closing in on me. Long shadows are cast by the tall shelves. I stopped to recover my breath when I got to the back office. I pushed the door open and it creaked a little. Even though the office was tiny and had paperwork and boxes that I didn't typically deal with, it seemed like the only place I could go tonight to escape the weird atmosphere in the store. I made an effort to concentrate on the task at hand, but my thoughts kept returning to the receipt. The time on it continued to play in my mind and the name Robert Adams appeared to be following me. I had just looked at the clock and it was precisely 4 a.m. I took a quick look at the workplace wall clock. The time was 4:05 a.m. A chill of unease ran up my spine. It was still the same time. Everything seemed to be still. The feeling that something was terribly wrong persisted. I tried to calm my breathing as I sat down at the desk. Now the silence was nearly intolerable. This was different from the late shifts I had typically worked. I was not isolated. The feeling of being observed had only intensified. I no longer had it in my head. I hurried to my feet, feeling confined. I had to leave that office. As I started to head for the door, I heard a faint but distinct sound. The gentle rustle of paper in the wind. The store's main level appeared to be the source of the noise. I froze and listened carefully. The rustling got closer and louder. I couldn't ignore it, but I wasn't sure if it was the wind, the air conditioning, or something else. I carefully took a step back toward the entrance, attempting to balance my breathing. Even though my hand was on the door handle, I was still unable to open it. My hand remained on the door handle while I stood there for what seemed like an eternity. There was an eerie silence once the rustling sound abruptly ended. My heart was thudding in my ears and pounding in my chest. No air conditioner vent was near enough to produce that sound, and there was no breeze. I inhaled deeply before carefully opening the door and returning inside the store. As I walked toward the aisles, my footfall resonating in the quiet, the lights flickered once more. The weird feeling of being watched was still there. I had to take another look at the receipt. The receipt was no longer on the surface where I had left it when I got to the counter. I felt sick to my stomach. No one had entered in any way. I hadn't heard anyone enter and the doors were locked. Nevertheless, I had the unnerving feeling that something was going on in the background of this silent shop. With my heart pounding, I began to look around the store. The receipt was nowhere to be found, even though there was no evidence of it. I couldn't get rid of the sensation that something invisible was observing me. The shadows were longer than necessary, and the aisles were eerily deserted. Time seemed to have frozen even though the clock read 4:15 a.m. The shop was frozen, motionless as if the world were limited to this instant. I scanned the shelves as I made my way to the farthest aisle. At that moment I caught a glimpse of it, a dim shadow fluttering just beyond my field of vision. I spun around, but there was still no one in the aisle. The sense that something or someone was hovering just out of view was becoming more intense. I wanted to walk away, but something held me in place. The silence was intolerable and the air had become colder. I thought I was going crazy. I looked at the clock once more. 4:15 a.m. was still the time. Neither time nor the store had changed. For a while, I stood there attempting to gather myself, but my gaze kept straying to the shadows between the bookshelves. Then the slight sound of rustling returned. It was clearer and louder this time. It originated in the rear of the shop, the vicinity of the stockroom. For a moment I stood motionless, attempting to identify what it was. It sounded more like footsteps the more I listened. A beat skipped in my chest. Steps. With my thoughts racing, I moved slowly in the direction of the stockroom. Nobody else was present. Was it present? The sound of footsteps increased, but I saw no one. I was certain that I was hearing sounds. However, the sound wouldn't.